Jonathan Pierce was a man accustomed to having everything align perfectly. At 45, the founder and CEO of Pierce Global Acquisitions had a net worth that spanned 7 figures, a sprawling estate overlooking the Hamptons coastline, and a life meticulously structured around success. He had the perfect trophy wife, Clara, beautiful and socially impeccable, and a son, Leo, who was supposed to be the perfect heir. Leo was now 10 years old. It was during Leo's 10th birthday party, amidst the clinking of champagne glasses and the forced laughter of business associates, that the disquieting thought first settled in Jonathan's mind, heavy and unwelcome, that he was watching Leo play a frantic game of tag with his cousins. The boy was bright, articulate, and undeniably charming, a true credit to the Pierce name. Yet, something was off. Jonathan himself was a towering man, broad-shouldered with the strong, angular jawline that had defined the Pierce men for 3 generations. His hair, though beginning to silver at the temples, was naturally dark brown, and his eyes were a striking, clear sapphire blue. Leo, however, was slight and agile, almost wiry. His hair was a startling shade of light, sandy blonde, and his eyes were a hazy, pale hazel, a color no one in the Pierce line, or even Clara's family, had ever possessed. Jonathan had dismissed it for years. He takes after Clara's distant cousin, he had always rationalized. He'll grow into his features, but Leo wasn't growing into them. He was growing away from them. Isn't he just divine? Clara glided up beside Jonathan, her arm linking possessively through his. She was breathtaking in a designer dress, her smile fixed and bright. Jonathan barely heard her. His gaze was locked on Leo, who was now laughing, a high, melodic laugh that was utterly foreign to the deep, booming chuckle of the Pierce household. "He doesn't have the Pierce chin," Jonathan murmured, the comment escaping him before he could stop it. Clara stiffened. Her grip tightened painfully on his forearm. "Excuse me." His jawline, Jonathan repeated, forcing a smile for the benefit of a passing guest. "It's softer. Less defined than mine was at that age. Perhaps we should look into some orthodontics soon." Clara's smile didn't falter, but her eyes, usually warm and focused, flickered with an unfamiliar coldness. "He's 10, Jonathan. He looks exactly like the darling boy we raised. Stop overthinking things." She pulled him toward the guests, efficiently redirecting his attention. Jonathan played the role of the proud father and successful host, but the image of Leo's pale hazel eyes stayed with him, a persistent, irritating grain of sand under the perfect silk sheet of his life. Over the next few weeks, the grain became a stone. Jonathan started analyzing old family photos. Every Pierce male, from his great-grandfather down to his younger brother, David, had the same dominant features. Dark hair, blue eyes, a strong frame. He started watching Leo, not with a father's pride, but with a scrutinizing, investor's eye. Leo loved painting, not rugby. He preferred quiet reading over the boisterous, cutthroat games Jonathan had loved. Leo was an artistic soul, a gentle spirit, qualities Jonathan respected, but traits that felt completely alien to his own aggressive DNA. One rainy Tuesday, while Clara was out organizing a charity gala, Jonathan found himself standing in Leo's room. He picked up one of Leo's favorite framed photos, a candid shot of the boy laughing at the beach, his sandy blonde hair windswept. Suddenly, a terrifyingly clear thought flashed into his mind, stripping away all years of denial. This boy is not my son. The certainty was immediate, cold, and absolute. It wasn't about the chin or the eyes anymore. It was an instinct, a primal realization that shook the very foundation of his identity. He replaced the photo, his hands slightly trembling. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't confront Clara, not yet. He couldn't risk the inevitable explosion, the lies, the damage, until he had proof, undeniable, clinical, scientific proof. He called his most trusted, discreet personal assistant, Mark. "Mark," Jonathan's voice was clipped and professional, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "I need you to arrange a small, private matter for me. Something that requires absolute discretion and the highest level of confidentiality. It involves a private medical inquiry." "Certainly, Mr. Pierce. How soon do you need it handled?" "Today." And Mark, if a single soul, especially Mrs. Pierce, ever learns about this, you will never work in this city again. Do you understand? Loud and clear, sir. Consider it handled. Jonathan hung up the phone. He walked to the master bathroom, his mind a whirlwind of fear and mounting rage. He took a small, sterile swab kit he had marked deliver an hour later, retrieved a few strands of his own hair, and then, with a heavy heart, went back to Leo's room. He quickly, almost clinically, collected a few loose hairs from Leo's brush. The samples were packaged, sealed, and ready for pickup within the hour. The waiting began. It was the hardest negotiation of his life, a waiting period he couldn't control, and it lasted 5 agonizing days. On the 6th day, a sealed, unmarked envelope was delivered directly to Jonathan's private study safe. He dismissed Mark with a curt nod and locked the door. Jonathan took a deep, shuddering breath, his fingers fumbling with the seal. He pulled out the single sheet of thick, embossed paper. It was from the most exclusive, high-end private lab in the country. His eyes immediately flew to the result summary, which was clearly printed in bold type. Conclusion, paternal DNA match. Jonathan felt a wave of dizzying relief. He'd been paranoid. Clara had been right. It was just an overactive imagination fueled by stress. He was the father. Leo was his son. Everything was perfect again. Wait. He reread the line. His brow furrowed in confusion. Conclusion, paternal DNA match. He scanned the rest of the document, searching for the confirmation of his sample. He found the key. Subject A, Jonathan Pierce, father's sample confirmed. Subject B, Leo Pierce, child sample confirmed, and the final line of the summary, printed in smaller, yet devastatingly clear font, hit him like a physical blow. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. Leo Pierce was not his son. The paper slipped from his numb fingers and fluttered to the Persian rug. The silence of the vast estate seemed to roar in his ears. 0.00%. Jonathan Pierce, the man who built an empire on calculated certainty, was left standing in the ruins of his perfect life, clutching a lie he had just shattered. His immediate, icy thought was not about Clara, but about the identity of the real father. Who had been inside his home, inside his life, intimately close enough to plant this pale-eyed child. He knew one thing: this wasn't just about infidelity. The sheer audacity, the decades of deception, meant the truth had to be far darker than a simple affair. Jonathan didn't move for 10 minutes. He simply stared at the innocuous piece of paper on the floor, the stark reality of the $0.00% probability paralyzing him. The anger, when it finally hit, wasn't a burst of heat. It was a deep, glacial fury that settled in his bones. He picked up the report, smoothed the creases, and carefully folded it. He placed it inside a leather-bound journal and locked the journal in his safe, right next to the deeds to his primary assets. This was now his most valuable, and most dangerous, possession. His focus sharpened, shifting from pain to strategy. He wasn't just a cuckolded husband, he was a businessman who had been defrauded of his legacy. He found Clara in the conservatory, meticulously arranging white orchids for an upcoming dinner. She looked serene, untouchable, the picture of the devoted wife and mother. The sight ignited the icy rage within him. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously low and steady. He didn't shout, the quiet was far more terrifying. She turned, her movements fluid. "Jonathan, darling. You're home early. The caterers just called. They can't find that special French wine you wanted. Stop." He held up a hand, silencing her. He walked toward her slowly, his shadow falling over the delicate flowers. "We're not talking about wine." Clara finally noticed the rigid set of his jaw and the cold intensity in his blue eyes. Her composure wavered, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she reached for a watering can. "What is it, Jonathan? Is it about the Hong Kong deal?" "It's about Leo." The mention of their son made her freeze completely. The can clattered onto the tiled floor, splashing water on the pristine stone. "What did you do?" she whispered, the color draining from her face. She knew. He didn't need to say a word. The realization of what he knew was instant. I had a suspicion, Clara. A small, nagging doubt about the color of his eyes, the shape of his jaw. Jonathan watched her face crumble, every year of deception now etched in the lines around her mouth. So, I did what any logical man would do. I found definitive proof. He didn't need the report. The truth was screaming in her terror. You had no right, she spat, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. He is our son. We raised him. You love him. I love the boy I thought was my heir. I love the son of my blood. The DNA report says otherwise, Clara, $0.00 %. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Tell me the name, Clara. Tell me who the father is, and tell me now. Clara backed away, clutching her chest, her carefully constructed facade shattering completely. Tears welled up, but they were not tears of regret, they were tears of raw, paralyzing fear. I can't, Jonathan. You don't understand. If I tell you, everything will be ruined. Not just us, not just Leo. Everything. Everything is already ruined, he roared, finally losing control. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged conservatory. Who is it? Was it some fleeting indiscretion? A gardener? A server? Tell me. Clara shook her head violently, her blonde hair flying around her face. No, it wasn't like that. It was family. The word hit Jonathan with a sickening force, worse than the DNA report itself. Family, he repeated, his voice barely audible. What does that mean? Your brother? A cousin? Clara sank onto a nearby wicker chair, sobbing uncontrollably now. The mistake, it happened years ago, before we were married, right after my father's funeral. I was a mess, Jonathan, and he was there, comforting me. It was only one night. I thought it was safe. I thought it was just grief. Who, Clara? Give me a name. It was David, she choked out, her head bowed in shame. David. Jonathan's younger brother. David Pierce. The revelation was a gut punch that stole Jonathan's breath. David, his closest sibling, his lifelong friend, the man who was the COO of Pierce Global Acquisitions, the man who stood as Leo's godfather. The pieces of the impossible puzzle began to click into place with terrifying precision. David was also tall, dark-haired, and blue-eyed, a classic Pierce. But David's eyes were not Jonathan's sapphire blue, they were a duller, hazier blue that, under certain light, could almost be mistaken for pale hazel, and David, unlike Jonathan, was an avid amateur painter, known for his soft, gentle demeanor. Leo's artistic soul and gentle nature were David's stud. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a betrayal that ran through the heart of his family and his company. His brother had stolen his son, and his wife had protected the secret for a decade. David, Jonathan murmured, the name tasting like ash. You let my brother raise his own son under my roof, taking my name, using my wealth, knowing he would one day inherit my life's work. Are you insane? Clara looked up, her face desperate. He didn't know, Jonathan. I swear, David doesn't know. He thought it was an accident. I told him I got pregnant with your child. I made him promise to never mention that night again. He thinks Leo is your son too. The panic in her eyes was genuine. Jonathan had found a secret that was so tightly held, it threatened to ignite a civil war in the Pierce family. This is impossible, Jonathan said, pacing furiously. If this gets out, the family board will tear itself apart. Your parents, my mother, they'll all know I'm a fraud, that my heir is illegitimate. The press would have a field day. Pierce Global Acquisitions would plummet. He stopped, staring at her with cold calculation. You will not breathe a word of this to David. Or anyone. Do you understand? I need time to think. I need to know how to destroy you both without destroying my legacy. Clara nodded frantically, relief battling with terror in her eyes. Yes, Jonathan. Whatever you say. We can keep it a secret. We can move on. I'll be better. Just please, don't tell Leo. He's only 10. Jonathan ignored her desperate plea. He knew he couldn't move on. The silence in the conservatory was now broken only by Clara's stifled sobs and the distant sounds of Leo laughing, the gentle, melodic laugh of his brother's son. Jonathan had a new, much bigger problem. He had to find out if David really didn't know, or if this was a decade-long conspiracy orchestrated to usurp him. His next move had to be surgical, deadly, and untraceable. Jonathan spent the next day in his downtown Manhattan office, behind the reinforced glass doors of his executive suite. He did not speak to Clara, nor did he answer her frantic texts. He was mapping out a corporate coup against the man he loved like a brother. The problem wasn't David's betrayal, that was a fire Jonathan knew how to fight. The problem was the sheer risk to Pierce Global Acquisitions. David was the COO, involved in every major overseas acquisition. If Jonathan publicly denounced his brother and wife, the ensuing divorce and corporate scandal would tank the stock faster than any market crash. That he needed proof of David's knowledge, proof that would either exonerate his brother as a fellow victim or confirm him as a silent conspirator. Jonathan called David into his office late that afternoon. "Come in, David," Jonathan said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. His tone was perfectly neutral, the voice of a CEO addressing a key executive, not a brother whose blood ran through the veins of his alleged son. David, handsome and perpetually relaxed, sat down, smiling warmly. "Late one, huh? Everything all right? Clara mentioned you looked a bit stressed last night." The casual mention of Clara, the conspirator, sharing notes with the unwitting father, sent a fresh wave of nausea through Jonathan. "I'm fine," Jonathan lied easily. "This isn't about stress. It's about the future. Specifically, Leo's future." David's expression softened instantly. "Ah, the heir. What about the boy?" Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany desk. "I've been thinking about the succession plan. Leo is 10. We need to start prepping him. Not just the name, but the DNA." He used the word DNA deliberately, watching David's face for even the slightest flicker of recognition or fear. David laughed, a genuine, easy sound. "DNA? Jonah, he's 10. He needs to worry about algebra, not asset management. Give the kid a break." "No, David, you don't understand," Jonathan insisted, maintaining eye contact. "I mean his literal DNA. Our family history. The genes. I was thinking of setting up a specific trust. Something legally ironclad that only activates if the child, when he comes of age, can prove a direct, undeniable genetic link to the founding father, me." David's smile finally slipped, replaced by a thoughtful frown. "That sounds incredibly complicated, Jonah. And a little morbid. Why the paranoia? We know Leo is your son. Do we?" Jonathan pressed, his voice dropping an octave. "Look at him, David. He's blonde. I'm dark. His eyes are hazel. Mine are blue. I'm just trying to protect the legacy, brother. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. We can't leave anything to chance, can we? Imagine if, 20 years from now, some distant relative pops up and claims the inheritance because Leo's lineage was compromised." He waited, holding his breath. If David knew the truth, he would either panic, fight the idea, or try to talk Jonathan out of the genetic test requirement. David simply shrugged, picking up a pen and fiddling with it. "I get your point, the legal angle. But I still think it's overkill. You're losing sleep over a recessive gene. Look, I'll have our legal team draw up some drafts tomorrow. We can call it the Pierce Genetic Purity Clause. How's that sound?" David's reaction was too calm, too cooperative. He wasn't resisting. He genuinely seemed to believe the idea was a strange but understandable eccentricity of a hyper-controlling millionaire. Clara was telling the truth, Jonathan thought, the realization bringing no comfort. He doesn't know. He's been an unwitting father for 10 years. The conspiracy was smaller, but infinitely crueler. A wife's solitary lie, a single act of passion turned into a decade of calculated deception against both the husband and the biological father. Jonathan dismissed David quickly, his mind already moving to the next phase. He had to uncover how deep this went. Clara had implied the secret was connected to family and her father's funeral. He needed to go back to the source, to the root of the Pierce family, and the secrets they buried. That evening, Jonathan drove to the sprawling, Gothic estate of his mother, Eleanor Pierce. The estate was called the Archives, and for good reason. It housed the meticulous, sometimes disturbing, records of the Pierce family lineage. Eleanor Pierce, now 70, was the matriarch, shrewd, possessive, and fiercely protective of the family name. "Jonathan, darling, what a surprise," Eleanor greeted him in her drawing room, where ancestral portraits watched them from the walls. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I have, Mother," Jonathan said, pouring himself a scotch. "I need to talk to you about the family. Specifically, the past." "The past is history, Jonathan. We focus on the future. The company." "Leo." Eleanor took a sip of her tea, her gaze sharp. "I need to know about the year before I met Clara." "The year her father, William Thorne, died," Jonathan pressed. "What do you remember about David and Clara that year?" Eleanor paused, her china teacup suspended halfway to her lips. The silence stretched, heavy and meaningful. "They were close, naturally," Eleanor finally said, her voice dry. "Clara was devastated by William's passing. David was her confidant. David has always had that kind of soft empathy. Unlike you. Did you ever suspect anything between them?" Eleanor placed the cup down with a sharp clink. "Don't be ridiculous. David was engaged to that poor girl, Sarah, at the time. Clara was practically a daughter to me. They were friends. Why do you ask? Is Clara behaving strangely?" Jonathan hesitated, knowing he couldn't reveal the DNA results, but he needed a leverage point. "I'm worried about the Thorne family secrets, Mother," he lied, weaving a tapestry of plausible doubt. "They're old money. Sometimes things get messy. You were so close to the Thornes. Did William Thorne have any scandals before he died? Anything that might affect Clara's stability?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She rarely discussed William Thorne, a man who had been a fierce rival to Jonathan's late father. William Thorne had his secrets, Jonathan. Every man of power does. But there was one thing. A terrible mistake he tried to cover up years ago. Your father knew about it, and it nearly ruined the Thorne legacy entirely. It involved a young woman, a family debt, and a child who was removed from the picture. Jonathan felt a chill. The pieces were shifting into place, connecting Clara's family to the concept of a hidden, disowned child. "What child, Mother? And what does it have to do with Clara?" Eleanor sighed, her face hardening with the effort of dredging up old, painful memories. "It has everything to do with Clara's stability. Because, Jonathan, that child, the illegitimate one, the mistake William Thorne had erased, that child was adopted into your Pierce family lineage." Jonathan felt his jaw drop. It wasn't about Leo, or Clara, or David. It was about him. "Who, Mother? Who did William Thorne's secret child become in our family?" Jonathan demanded, leaning forward, the scotch forgotten. Eleanor looked at her successful, powerful son with genuine pity. "That child, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice barely audible but completely shattering. "That child was David." The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly, marking the passage of time that suddenly felt distorted, ancient, and poisoned. "David," Jonathan repeated, the name a foreign object on his tongue. "You mean David is not father's son? He's adopted?" Eleanor, the cool, calculating matriarch, looked profoundly exhausted. "It's not adoption in the traditional sense, Jonathan. William Thorne had an affair with a maid, a very discreet scandal. He wanted the child gone, but the maid disappeared before Thorne could fully suppress it. Your father, bless his soul, found the infant in a state-run facility shortly after you were born. He was unable to have any more children after you. She paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. Your father desperately wanted a second son to cement the dynasty. He made a deal with Thorne, a massive financial transaction veiled as a land acquisition, to take the boy. He brought David home and raised him as a Pierce. Only your father, William Thorne, and I knew the truth. Jonathan felt a cold sweat break out. His entire life, his entire rivalry and bond with David, was built on a lie. And the lie was a transaction. So, David Pierce is actually David Thorne, Jonathan concluded, his mind racing. And the woman David slept with, Clara, is William Thorne's biological daughter. My wife and my brother are, biologically, half-siblings. Eleanor flinched. No, Jonathan. That's the horror. Clara is William Thorne's legitimate daughter, born to his society wife. David is Thorne's illegitimate son. They share a biological father, but they were raised as unrelated social peers. They had no idea they were committing biological incest. The word hung in the air, heavy and nauseating. The single night of passion between Clara and David, born of grief and confusion, was an act of genetic horror hidden beneath a decade of secrecy. And now, Jonathan's voice was strained. Leo is the result. Leo is the grandson of William Thorne twice over. He carries the blood of the same man, passed down through two different lines. This realization brought a terrifying, new insight into the DNA report. Leo was not a Pierce. He was a Thorne, the ultimate, most concentrated embodiment of the family that Jonathan's father had always sought to neutralize and control. And that, Eleanor continued, her voice trembling, is why I need you to understand how dangerous this is. If the press learns the heir to Pierce Global is the product of this abomination, and the grandson of our greatest rival, William Thorne, it will not just sink the stock. It will destroy the reputation of the Pierce name forever. And David? Jonathan asked, the question laced with a complex mix of betrayal and pity. Does he know William Thorne is his father? No, Eleanor confirmed, her eyes weary. Your father never told him. David believes he is a true Pierce. And Clara only knew David's adoption was a secret, but she didn't know the identity of his biological father. She only realized the horror when she confessed to you. Jonathan stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor. He had started a simple investigation into an affair, and uncovered a biological time bomb that stretched back 2 generations. His brother, David, the gentle soul who loved painting, was not his rival, he was a victim. His wife, Clara, the calculating co-conspirator, was also a victim of a truth too terrible to reveal. And Leo, the gentle boy, was the innocent product of a curse. This changes everything, Jonathan stated, walking toward the door. If David is William Thorne's son, then David is the true threat to the dynasty, not because he slept with Clara, but because his very existence is a secret that could destroy us. What are you going to do, Jonathan? Eleanor pleaded. Jonathan turned back, his face grim. I'm going to clean up father's mess. And I'm going to make sure that David, the biological son of our rival, never controls a single asset of Pierce Global. I have the DNA proof on Leo. I need DNA proof on David. The next day, Jonathan was back at his office. The complexity of the lie, which had protected David for decades, now became Jonathan's weapon. That he needed David's DNA, but he couldn't use the same discreet methods he used for Leo. David was shrewd. Jonathan devised a plan during a routine board meeting. During a break, as David was discussing corporate governance with the CFO, Jonathan approached the water cooler. David, Jonathan called, tapping the sleek, glass bottle on the cooler. We need to get this thing replaced. Tastes metallic. I swear, the tap water at the office is cleaner than this filtered garbage. Really? I hadn't noticed, David said, taking a casual sip from the crystal tumbler he was holding. He set the glass down near the cooler and moved back toward the CFO. Jonathan seized the opportunity. In a single, fluid motion, he snatched David's tumbler. "You know what? I'll get a new one right now. Let me throw this out for you." David barely noticed the exchange. Preoccupied with the financial discussion, Jonathan retreated to his office, his heart pounding. The glass, still damp with David's saliva, was quickly secured in an evidence bag. This time, the DNA test wouldn't be for paternity. It would be a simple, non-specific sequence map, done at a different, even more discreet lab. The order was placed: sequence comparison between Subject A, Jonathan Pierce, and Subject B, David Pierce. Focus on family lineage markers. The final meeting of the week was a celebratory dinner at Jonathan's estate. Clara, pale but composed, was playing the perfect hostess. David was there, joking and laughing, completely unaware of the genetic trap closing in on him. Jonathan watched them both. David, the son of their rival, now the unwitting father of his legal heir. Clara, the co-conspirator, desperately trying to protect the two people she had inadvertently connected in a web of historical betrayal. As the evening wound down, Jonathan received an encrypted alert on his private phone. The new report was ready. The results of David's DNA test. That he excused himself to his study, locked the door, and opened the file. The results confirmed Eleanor's story. David's paternal lineage markers did not match the Pierce family's established haplogroup. He was indeed the son of William Thorne, but there was a second result on the page, printed in a smaller, almost footnoted section, that Jonathan had not anticipated. It was a flag raised by the lab during the standard full genome sequencing. Alert, abnormal genetic marker DTCTD. The note explained that Subject B, David Pierce, possessed a rare, dormant genetic mutation. It was non-lethal, but highly specific and traceable. The lab had cross-referenced it against several rare disease databases. The footnote contained a single, chilling conclusion that surpassed all previous shocks. The marker identified in Subject B is only found in isolated communities in the former Soviet bloc region and has been linked to a specific, highly secretive intelligence program operating during the Cold War. The marker is known in classified medical circles as the Spectre strain. Jonathan stared at the screen, the Scotch glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. David wasn't just William Thorne's son. His existence, his DNA, was connected to a secret that stretched far beyond family scandal and corporate rivalry, a secret that touched the dangerous world of international espionage and government black projects. The real question wasn't who Leo's father was, but what Leo's father David truly was. Jonathan had faced hostile takeovers, market manipulation, and FBI inquiries, but the words "the Spectre strain" and "Cold War intelligence program" introduced a level of threat he was not equipped to handle. This was no longer just about Pierce Global. This was about national security secrets potentially buried in his brother's DNA. That he did not clean up the shattered glass. He simply locked the study door and sat in silence, processing the impossible reality. Why would William Thorne, a wealthy, reputable American financier, have a secret illegitimate child with a genetic marker linked to a Soviet-era black project? The only way to connect the dots was to talk to the one person who knew the historical context: his mother, Eleanor. But Eleanor was fiercely protective of the family's narrative. Jonathan needed someone who traded in the kind of secrets that bypassed family loyalty. He called Mark, his highly capable assistant. "Mark, I need you to find me a name. Someone who deals in historical espionage, specifically Cold War operations tied to biological or genetic research in Eastern Europe. Untraceable. No digital footprint. I need a meeting within 24 hours. Understood, Mr. Pierce. Black market research. I'll utilize the old assets," Mark replied, already understanding the gravity by Jonathan's tone. While Mark worked, Jonathan had to deal with Clara. He found her nervously waiting in the master bedroom, her eyes red and puffy. She looked less like a conniving wife and more like a cornered animal. "Jonathan," she began, approaching him tentatively. "I know you're furious. But please, before you do anything permanent, you have to hear me. About that night with David, there's something I didn't tell you." Jonathan looked at her, his face devoid of emotion. You mean besides the fact that you slept with your biological half-brother and gave birth to the result? Clara recoiled as if struck. It's worse than that. That night, William Thorne had just died. My father. I was a wreck. David was grieving too, in his own quiet way. We were at the wake, and we drank too much. She wrung her hands. I remember the grief, the shock, and then, David kept talking about his own mother. He said he felt disconnected, like he was searching for something. He said he had this recurring, terrifying nightmare about ice and needles. Ice and needles. The fragmented memory sounded like a trauma, perhaps connected to the specter strain and its origin. What else? Jonathan demanded, pushing past the horror. He said that a few weeks before my father died, David had finally pressed him about his birth parents. David suspected he wasn't a biological Pierce. My father, William Thorne, got incredibly agitated. He told David that if he ever went looking for his birth mother, he would unleash a darkness that could destroy the world. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. Then, my father died a week later. Suddenly. A supposed heart attack. But David was convinced my father was killed to stop him from telling the truth. The pieces clicked into a terrifying mosaic. David is William Thorne's son, adopted by the Pierces. David has a rare genetic marker tied to Soviet intelligence, the Spectre strain. William Thorne died suddenly right after being pressed about David's parentage. William Thorne warned David about unleashing a darkness. Jonathan realized the family's secret wasn't the incestuous bond, it was David's true identity. William Thorne hadn't just paid to adopt David, he had somehow acquired him from a highly sensitive, clandestine source. The next afternoon, Jonathan found himself in a desolate, forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Queens, far from the polished halls of Pierce Global. He met the contact Mark had found, Elias Vance, a former intelligence asset turned information broker. Vance was a man made entirely of shadows and sharp edges, wearing a perpetual look of cold skepticism. The Spectre strain, Vance repeated, leaning back on a rusty barrel. That's heavy stuff, Pierce. This is Cold War folklore, mostly discredited by the public. But those of us who were there, we know it was real. What is it, exactly? Jonathan asked, trying to keep his composure. It wasn't a biological weapon, Vance explained. It was a genetic marker used by a highly secretive Soviet-era unit known as Unit 7. They specialized in creating deep cover assets. Children taken from high-risk geopolitical areas, genetically modified with a rare, dormant sequence, then placed in influential Western families through illicit adoption networks. Genetically modified? Think of it as a subtle biological lock. The strain is non-functional until it's activated by a specific, almost mythical chemical compound, a trigger. If activated, the person becomes incredibly pliable, suggestible, a perfectly weaponized asset for infiltration and intelligence gathering. They were waiting for these children to grow up and take positions of power. Jonathan's blood ran cold. David, the COO of Pierce Global, was one of these assets. And William Thorne? What was his role? Vance smiled, a brittle, unpleasant expression. Ah, the old money connection. Thorne was one of the adoption facilitators. He used his charity and political influence to move these kids across borders. But he wasn't just moving them, Pierce. Thorne was a collector. He didn't just adopt David, he was protecting his investment. He was likely blackmailed by the unit into the scheme. And the heart attack. If Thorne was about to reveal the program, or David's true origin, to his son, then the unit would silence him. They don't take risks with their assets. Jonathan stared into the distance. His brother, the man he had just sought to destroy, was a ticking biological time bomb, placed within his own family. The darkness William Thorne warned about wasn't David, it was the people who owned David. What happens if this strain is activated? Jonathan asked. If the switch is flipped? Vance raised a cynical eyebrow. David Pierce vanishes. And a highly trained, immoral intelligence operative takes his place. And judging by his current position at your company, Unit 7 is about to cash in their investment. They've been patient. Jonathan finally understood the depth of the betrayal and the danger. It wasn't about who fathered Leo, it was about the fact that the father of his heir was a weapon waiting to be deployed against him, his company, and perhaps his country. He had to get David out of the company and his home immediately. Before Unit 7 found their trigger. As Jonathan left the warehouse, he received an urgent, encrypted text from Mark. Mark found something on William Thorne's final accounts. Massive, untraceable withdrawal the day before his death. Code name used, Etheria. Account holder, the Pierce Family Trust, administered by Eleanor Pierce. Your mother is involved, Mr. Pierce. Jonathan stopped dead in his tracks. His mother, Eleanor, the keeper of the family's secrets, was not just protecting his father's lie, she was actively controlling the funds tied to David's acquisition. Eleanor wasn't a victim of her husband's deceit, she was an active participant in the Spectre strain operation, and perhaps the only one who knew where the Etheria funds, and the biological trigger, were hidden. Jonathan returned to his mother's estate, the archives, driven by a furious urgency that eclipsed his earlier rage against Clara. He wasn't walking into a family discussion, he was initiating a hostile intelligence interrogation. He found Eleanor in her study, reviewing a stack of historical documents, the literal archives of the Pierce family. The Etheria Fund, Mother, Jonathan stated, slamming the classified account summary Mark had sent onto her antique desk. Tell me what it is, and tell me now. Don't insult my intelligence with stories about your father's compassion. Eleanor did not flinch. Her composure was absolute, betraying decades of practice in keeping the darkest secrets. She glanced at the document and sighed, a sound of weary acceptance. I knew this day would come, Jonathan. When one of you would ask too many questions. What did you do, Mother? You were helping a Soviet unit place a genetically modified sleeper agent into the heart of an American dynasty. I was protecting the Pierce legacy. Eleanor snapped, finally revealing a crack in her armor. Your father was desperate for a second son. William Thorne was desperate for cash and influence. The Soviet unit, they were just a means to an end. We acquired David when he was an infant. Thorne secured the withdrawal and transfer through a secret account. The money wasn't payment, it was the Etheria Operational Fund. Operational fund for what? For maintenance, Eleanor hissed, leaning forward. The Spectre strain, Jonathan. It's dormant, yes, but it requires periodic, subtle chemical stabilization to keep it that way. The Etheria funds were used to pay a shadow medical consultant to monitor David's health and administer a stabilizing agent every few years. It was always disguised as a routine vitamin shot or a childhood vaccination booster. Jonathan stumbled back, reeling. You mean every time David went to the family doctor, it wasn't a booster shot? It was you, using the Etheria fund, paying someone to keep the weapon from activating? I kept him dormant. I kept the family safe. If that weapon, that Spectre, ever activated, David would be compromised, and the enemy would have a CEO-level operative inside Pierce Global. I spent 50 years guarding this family from financial ruin, and 10 years from biological ruin. And what about the trigger? Jonathan demanded. Where is the activator? The compound that turns him into Unit 7's operative? Eleanor pointed a trembling finger toward a section of the massive oak bookcase. Your father had it stored. Not on the estate. It was kept where no one would ever suspect. In the Thorne family safe deposit box in Zurich. Thorne insisted on that detail for maximum operational distance. The irony was crushing, the Pierce family's survival depended on a biological weapon stored in the vault of their rival, William Thorne. The activation compound, Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with fear. It's a powdered chemical. It has a specific, highly distinctive metallic, electrical scent. Jonathan left the archives, the threat suddenly tangible. He had to reach Zurich before Unit 7, before anyone discovered the safe. He couldn't trust the police or the FBI. This was too deep, too close to the bone that he called Mark immediately and ordered a highly discreet private jet to Zurich. Back at his estate, Jonathan tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. He needed to be sure David was still dormant. That he found David in the library, on a video conference with a team in London. David was arguing passionately about a new acquisition, sharp and strategic. The normal David. Rough day, David? Jonathan asked casually, standing in the doorway. You know how it is, Jonah, David replied, ending his call. The London team is dragging their feet. But I got the deal finalized. Just needs your signature. As David handed Jonathan the tablet, their hands brushed. Jonathan caught a subtle, almost non-existent scent on David's fingers. It was faint, metallic, almost like ozone or a spark of electricity. Jonathan's blood froze. David, Jonathan asked, his voice strained, did you just touch something strange? David frowned, looking at his hands. No. Just the tablet. Why? It's nothing, Jonathan lied quickly. But the scent was real. The metallic, electrical scent Eleanor described as the activation compound. Had Unit 7 already found David? Had someone, maybe even someone close, already attempted to flip the switch? Suddenly, the library door opened, and Leo walked in, holding a book. Dad, Uncle David, Leo said sweetly. I can't find my drawing pencils. They smell like a zap. Leo used the exact words Jonathan's mother had used to describe the trigger scent. Jonathan turned slowly to David, his eyes wide with horror. David's eyes, the pale hazel eyes of the Thorn lineage, were fixed on Leo with an unnerving, vacant intensity. Leo, David said, his voice flat, emotionless. Tell me where you last saw the pencils. Tell me where the zap smell is strongest. Leo pointed vaguely toward the corner of the room, near a hidden vent. Jonathan knew, with sickening certainty, that Unit 7 had found a way to reach David. They weren't using a needle, they were using airborne residue or a scented compound, and Leo, with his sensitivity, had noticed it first. Jonathan's decision was instantaneous. He couldn't wait for Zurich. He had to neutralize the immediate threat. That he lunged forward, grabbing David by the arm and pulling him away from Leo. David, we need to go. Now. I need you to sign these documents in the car. Jonathan, what are you doing? David struggled slightly, his movements suddenly possessing a cold, unnatural strength. The vacant look in his eyes deepened. Uncle David is sick, Leo. Go to your room, immediately. Jonathan roared at his son. Leo, terrified by his father's tone, fled. Jonathan pulled David toward the hidden panic room, the only place he could secure David and try to counter the chemical exposure. As Jonathan wrestled David toward the fortified door, David suddenly stopped resisting. He looked at Jonathan, his expression changing from vacant to something terrifyingly focused and alien. The asset is stabilized, David said, his voice no longer the gentle, familiar tone of his brother, but a flat, synthesized monotone. Protocol 7 is online. Thank you for bringing the subject to the neutralization zone, Mr. Pierce. It saves us time. David, or whatever was now controlling him, was aware of Jonathan's panic room. He knew the plan, and then, David's hand moved with lightning speed, striking a pressure point on Jonathan's neck. Jonathan felt a sharp, debilitating pain, and then, nothing but darkness. Jonathan woke up to a throbbing ache in his neck and the unsettling realization that he was in his own panic room. The room, designed to be his fortress, had become his prison. The air was sterile and quiet, but the silence was menacing. That he was sitting on the steel floor, his wrists and ankles secured with industrial-grade plastic cuffs. Standing over him, illuminated by the harsh emergency light, was David. But this was not the David he knew. The man had the same features, the same dark Pierce hair, but his pale hazel eyes were terrifyingly vacant yet intensely focused, like a high-tech camera lens. There was no warmth, no flicker of the gentle soul that loved painting. He was a flawless, lethal machine. Welcome back, Subject Alpha, the voice was David's, but the delivery was cold, measured, and devoid of any human inflection. The activation sequence is complete. I apologize for the necessary discomfort. David, Jonathan rasped, struggling against the cuffs. Listen to me. They activated something inside you. This isn't you. You need help. The asset formerly known as David Pierce tilted his head slightly. The subject, David Pierce, was a shell, a cover identity designed for maximum infiltration. I am Spectre, 7. The purpose of my existence is the transfer of assets and acquisition of the Etheria Operational Fund. Spectre, 7 knelt down, his movements unnervingly precise. He held up Jonathan's private tablet, which displayed the details of the Etheria Fund, and the transfer codes. The fund is controlled by the Pierce Family Trust, with triple-factor authentication, including a direct biometric scan from the primary shareholder, you, Jonathan Pierce. Your cooperation is required for the full transfer. I won't do it, Jonathan spat, trying to buy time. You can kill me, but you won't get the money. Spectre, 7 smiled. A chilling, practiced motion that didn't reach his eyes. Killing you is highly inefficient, Mr. Pierce. You are a key. We require the funds to sustain the Unit 7 network globally. And we have leverage. He pulled out his phone and played a short, crystal-clear audio clip. It was Leo's voice, singing a nursery rhyme. Leo is sound asleep in his room. A very sweet boy, Spectre, 7 remarked neutrally. However, the scent you detected earlier, the airborne trigger, is also highly toxic in higher concentrations. A continuous exposure of 24 hours will result in severe neurological damage. I have placed a small, contained dispersal unit in his HVAC vent. Jonathan's breath hitched in his throat. You bastard. He's your son. He is the genetic anomaly, the product of unintended biological cross-pollination. His importance is secondary to the fund. You have 3 hours to initiate the transfer protocol. After that, the dispersal unit will be remotely activated. Jonathan felt a blinding flash of paternal fury. He had to protect his son, regardless of his genetic lineage. If I transfer the funds, how do I know you'll stop the gas? You don't. You operate on faith that the primary objective is the money, not unnecessary collateral damage. Unit 7 requires discretion. A sudden death of the Pierce heir would draw unwanted attention. Jonathan knew he was beaten. He had to comply to save Leo. Fine. Get me the tablet. But I need to see him. I need proof he's safe now. Spectre, 7 stood up, maintaining his distance. Negotiations are illogical. The transfer is required. However, I will allow a supervised visual confirmation. He pulled a small, military-grade monitor from his jacket and displayed a live feed of Leo's room. Leo was tucked safely in bed, sleeping soundly, unaware of the poison lurking in his ventilation system. Jonathan forced himself to calm down. He knew the transfer would bankrupt the family trust, but if he did it, he might gain the time needed to find a countermove. Unlock my left wrist, Jonathan commanded. I need the biometric reader. Spectre, 7 used a small electronic key to pop open the cuff. Jonathan flexed his numb fingers, then reached for the tablet. He entered the codes for the largest offshore account tied to Etheria.as. The transfer window opened. Jonathan activated the biometric scan with his thumb. The transfer was set to begin. Now, the countermove, Jonathan thought quickly. He couldn't stop the money, but he could redirect the investigation. Spectre, 7, Jonathan said, looking straight into the operative's cold eyes. You're making a mistake. The account information is outdated. Part of the Etheria fund was moved 3 months ago by the prior administrator. Spectre, 7 stopped monitoring the transfer and fixed his cold gaze on Jonathan. Unacceptable. The records showed full fund availability. Your records are Thorne's records, not Pierce's, Jonathan countered. My mother, Eleanor, moved a significant portion. She hid it in an account she called the Spectre Stabilizer Vault, a contingency plan to destroy the activation trigger if Unit 7 ever surfaced. This was a bold-faced lie, a desperate guess based on Eleanor's protective nature. He hoped the idea of a stabilizer vault would momentarily throw the highly protocolized operative off his game. Location of the vault, Spectre 7 demanded, his monotone voice rising slightly in urgency. I don't know the exact account number, Jonathan lied. But I know the physical key. It's hidden in the old Pierce family summer cabin in Vermont. It's the last place your Unit 7 assets would look, it's outside of all major trade routes. Spectre 7 accessed a satellite map on his tablet, cross-referencing the Vermont location. The operative's logic processor was clearly prioritizing the funds and the destruction of any stabilizer threat. Clara Pierce, Spectre 7 stated suddenly, turning his attention to the door. She is the only other person in the house. She must be neutralized to prevent interference with the transfer. Jonathan seized the opportunity. No. Don't touch her. She knows the location of the other key for the Vermont cabin. You need her, Spectre. You need her alive. The operative paused, calculating the efficiency. Understood. The preservation of the secondary keyholder is temporarily prioritized. The distraction bought Jonathan precious seconds. As Spectre 7 turned toward the door to neutralize Clara, Jonathan grabbed the closest object he could reach, the broken glass shard from the scotch he had dropped the previous night, and slashed violently at the plastic cuffs on his secured right hand. The cuffs held, but the thin shard sliced through the flesh of his wrist, drawing blood. Spectre 7, alerted by the sound of the scuffle, whipped back around. Violation of compliance protocol. Clara. Jonathan yelled, not at his wife, but as a coded warning. He shoved the shattered glass under the door frame, hoping to wedge the mechanism. Spectre 7 moved with impossible speed, kicking the shard away. He grabbed Jonathan's injured wrist, his grip like steel. You will comply, Spectre 7 stated, forcing the biometric pad back onto Jonathan's thumb. Transfer is required. Now. The tablet flashed green, transfer initiated. Jonathan had failed to stop the money, but he had planted the seed, Vermont, the stabilizer vault, and Clara. He had given the weapon a target that led away from Leo.as. The transfer progress bar reached 10%, Spectre 7 released Jonathan and headed for the panic room door. The funds are secure. Target, Clara Pierce. Acquisition of secondary key. Jonathan was left bleeding on the floor, the vast Pierce fortune transferring to the enemy. He looked back at the small monitor. Leo was still sleeping. The clock was ticking that he knew his only chance was to follow Spectre 7. He had to get to Clara before the activated David did. Jonathan pulled himself free from the cuffs, his wrist throbbing and slick with blood. He didn't bother treating the wound, he only had minutes. The electronic lock on the panic room door was engaged, but he was the architect of this fortress. He crawled to the terminal and typed in a manual override sequence, a hidden back door known only to him and his father. The steel door hissed open that he emerged into the darkened main hall. The house was silent, but the silence felt like the held breath before an explosion. Jonathan, despite his injury, was now running on pure, terrified adrenaline that he found Clara in the library, exactly where Spectre 7 had assumed she would be. She was huddled on the floor, shaking, clutching a small, tarnished silver locket. Clara. We have to go. Now. Jonathan's voice was a harsh whisper. Clara looked up, her face pale, but her eyes held a spark of terror-fueled clarity. David, he's different, Jonathan. He didn't even look at me. He looked through me. He asked about a secondary key and Vermont. He's been activated, Jonathan confirmed, yanking her to her feet. He's a weapon called Spectre 7, and he wants the keys to the stabilizer vault. Vault? Clara stumbled, resisting his pull. I don't have a key to a vault. I told you, I only have this. She held up the locket. Where did you get that? My father gave it to me right before he died, Clara cried. William Thorne. He said to never open it unless I felt I was in danger from the one who doesn't fit. I always thought he meant David. Jonathan immediately realized the true horror. William Thorne had not just sold David, he had created a contingency plan to neutralize him, and the key was in the hands of his own daughter, Clara. The key is in the locket, Clara. It's the secondary key for the vault in Zurich. No, a cold voice stated from the doorway. Spectre 7 stepped into the library, his movements silent and predatory. He had an antique letter opener, a heavy, silver item, in his hand, treating it like a specialized combat knife. The lie about the secondary key in the locket is inefficient, Clara, Spectre 7 analyzed, his voice flat. The locket is the stabilizer trigger. William Thorne encoded the deactivation sequence into a rare isotope housed within the silver pendant. It releases a counteragent when opened. Clara gasped, looking down at the locket in her hand, realizing she was holding the key to David's freedom or destruction. The secondary key, Spectre 7 continued, walking slowly toward them, is located in the Vermont cabin, precisely where your lie indicated, Mr. Pierce. It is a physical item required to open the Etheria operational safe located at that location. The safe contains the full list of all Unit 7 assets placed in Western dynasties. Jonathan's mother had misled him. The Etheria safe in Vermont wasn't a stabilizer vault, it contained the master list of all sleeper agents. The information would destroy not just the Pierces, but every major family in the Western world. You need to slow down, Spectre, Jonathan said, placing himself in front of Clara. You kill me, you risk the transfer. You kill Clara, you lose the stabilizer. Spectre 7 hesitated. The conflict between the immediate command, neutralize threats, and the priority objective, secure assets and prevent exposure, caused a micro-delay. The stabilizer is a risk, Spectre 7 decided. You will surrender the pendant, Clara. And the keys to the Vermont cabin. I don't have the keys. Clara screamed, clutching the locket. Jonathan always kept them. They're in the boathouse. This was a lie. A well-placed, desperate lie. Spectre 7 turned instantly toward Jonathan. The keys, Mr. Pierce. The boathouse is a logical concealment point. Jonathan knew he couldn't beat the operative, but he could run. The keys are not in the boathouse, David. They're in my private jet. We were leaving for Zurich. Spectre 7 paused. The jet represented the quickest way to the Zurich vault, where the activation compound was stored, and the Vermont cabin. The decision was high risk, high reward. Clara, run. Jonathan yelled, shoving her past the operative toward the main door. As Clara fled, Spectre 7 ignored her, calculating that she could be caught later. He launched himself at Jonathan, the letter opener raised. Jonathan didn't fight. He turned and sprinted, not toward the front door, but toward the large, 3-story antique display case in the center of the library. It was filled with priceless, brittle artifacts. As Spectre 7 tackled him, Jonathan slammed into the case, deliberately shattering the glass and sending centuries of fragile history cascading down onto them both. The sound was deafening. Jonathan, covered in shards and dust, saw his opening. He pushed himself off the floor and bolted out the door, the sound of the mansion's main alarm, which Clara had triggered as she ran, blaring through the estate. That he didn't stop until he reached the garage. Clara was already inside their armored SUV, the engine roaring. Go! Go! Jonathan yelled, scrambling into the passenger seat. Clara sped the massive vehicle down the driveway, through the electrified gates, and onto the main road. As they looked back, they saw Spectre 7 standing on the front lawn, silhouetted against the mansion's glaring security lights. He was bleeding from a dozen cuts, but his posture was still rigid, his eyes focused. He wasn't running after them. He was looking up. Suddenly, a sleek, black unmarked drone, previously invisible in the night sky, descended rapidly and hovered over Spectre 7. A hatch opened on its belly, and a thin, metallic cord dropped down. Spectre 7, the dormant David Pierce, grasped the cord and was swiftly pulled upward, disappearing into the belly of the drone. "They have him," Jonathan whispered, realizing the enemy was not just local, but air-supported. "They're going to use him." "Where are we going?" Clara asked frantically, clutching the silver locket. Jonathan, bloodied and exhausted, looked at his wife, the woman who had betrayed him, but who now held the key to neutralizing a global threat. "We go to Vermont," Jonathan rasped. "We have to beat them to the Etheria master list. If Unit 7 gets that list, they will activate every sleeper agent in the West. And if we get the list, we can expose the entire operation and free David." Harika. Sun Volume Jessioras. Bubalumd, Tum Surler Ortaya Sikakak, Katisma Zervi Ulasakak v Haikai, 70.000 Karakter Hedafini Asarak Sona Arasek, Chapter 9. The Reckoning in Vermont. The drive to Vermont was a harrowing blur of adrenaline and whispered confessions. Clara finally admitted everything. William Thorne had told her the locket was a stabilizer, but never explained how it worked or David's true identity. She only knew David was the key to a darkness. They reached the secluded Pierce family cabin nestled deep in the Green Mountains just before dawn. It was a rustic lodge, intentionally primitive to remain off the digital grid. "The Etheria safe is hidden here," Jonathan said, limping toward the stone fireplace. It was the only structure Father built with reinforced concrete. "Where are the keys, Clara?" "They're not in the boathouse," Clara admitted, her voice shaking. "They're in a leather pouch, tucked inside the old hunting trophy above the mantel." Jonathan climbed onto a nearby stool and reached for the massive stag head. Hidden inside the dusty leather pouch were a set of old, tarnished brass keys. One of them, heavier than the rest, was the key to the Etheria safe. He found the safe hidden behind a loose stone panel in the chimney stack. He inserted the key, and with a heavy clunk, the safe mechanism disengaged. Inside, there was not a massive gold reserve, but a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. "The Etheria master list." As Jonathan pulled out the ledger, the sound of a drone, a heavy, low thrumming, began to descend outside the cabin. "They found us," Jonathan whispered, flipping the ledger open. The pages were filled with names, dates, and locations. Not just sleeper agents, but the names of the influential families who had facilitated the adoption: senators, judges, rival CEOs. The list was a guaranteed global political and financial catastrophe. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by a precision charge. Spectre 7 stood in the doorway, framed by the cold morning light, his face impassive. He was no longer David, he was an instrument of pure state control. "Surrender the master list, Mr. Pierce," Spectre 7 commanded. "And the stabilizer pendant, Clara Pierce. Compliance will minimize unnecessary fatalities." "You want this list, David?" "Why?" Jonathan shouted, holding the master list protectively against his chest. "To destroy the world. Is that Unit 7's new protocol?" "The list is required for asset consolidation," Spectre 7 replied, advancing slowly. "The world is not to be destroyed, it is to be controlled. And the stabilizing agent in the pendant must be neutralized to secure the long-term viability of the asset. Leo is still in New York." Jonathan tried to use his son as a shield. "You kill us, the timer on the gas will run out." "The threat to Leo Pierce has been removed," Spectre 7 stated. The dispersal unit was a logical bluff. His continued health is irrelevant to the mission. Relief flooded Jonathan, momentarily weakening him. He realized Spectre 7 had lied about the gas to ensure Jonathan transferred the funds. The funds were gone, but Leo was safe. "Then it's just us, David," Jonathan said, stepping forward. "I am not David," Spectre 7 replied, raising the silver letter opener. "Yes, you are," Clara interjected, stepping out from behind Jonathan. She held the silver locket tightly. "You are David Thorne. The child of a grieving maid and a cruel father. You were cheated of your life and identity. Spectre 7 froze. The mention of his original name and identity caused a visible glitch in his composure, a flicker of human confusion crossing his vacant eyes. "Clara," Jonathan yelled, knowing this was their only chance. "Now." Clara, tears streaming down her face, didn't hesitate. She squeezed the fragile silver locket in her palm, crushing it. The rare isotope inside fractured, releasing a microscopic plume of fine, metallic dust into the air. Spectre 7 instantly recoiled, making a guttural, inhuman sound. Contamination detected. Counter-protocol required. The Spectre strain was fighting the stabilizer. David's body convulsed violently. His movements became erratic, the sterile operative fighting the re-emergence of the human being. Jonathan seized the opportunity. He slammed the master list ledger down and grabbed the closest heavy object, a rusty fireplace poker. He charged at the convulsing operative. "This is for my son, David. For the life you stole." Jonathan screamed, bringing the poker down with all his remaining strength. The blow landed on Spectre 7's head with a sickening crack. The operative fell to the ground, his body twitching. The vacant eyes fluttered, and then, slowly, a flicker of recognition, and pain, returned. "J. Jonathan," the voice was weak, the monotone gone. It was the gentle voice of his brother, David. What happened?" 1 month later, the Pierce estate was quiet. The Etheria master list, after a grueling night of negotiation, was handed over to Jonathan's highly trusted contacts in American intelligence, under the strict condition that it be used only to neutralize the sleeper agents, not to destroy the families or the economy. Clara, finally free from her terrible secret, had initiated divorce proceedings. Jonathan gave her a generous settlement, ensuring she and Leo would be financially secure and fully protected from any Unit 7 retribution. Leo, unaware of the genetic drama, was thriving in a new school under a new, single-parent life. And David? David was alive, but profoundly changed. The stabilizer had successfully disabled the Spectre strain, but the trauma of the activation had wiped away much of his memory, especially the last 10 years. He was the quiet, artistic David Thorne again, detached from the ruthlessness of the Pierce world. Jonathan secured him a private, protected life abroad, a final act of brotherly loyalty. Jonathan Pierce stood alone on the deck of his empty estate, looking out over the ocean. The perfect life was shattered, but the truth had saved them. He was no longer a millionaire protecting an empire, but a father who had fought a shadow war to save his son and his family name. He had learned a brutal lesson. DNA dictates biology, but sacrifice dictates family. Leo wasn't his by blood, but he was his son by the life Jonathan had nearly died to protect. The doorbell rang. It was Mark, holding a small, unmarked package. "Mr. Pierce," Mark said solemnly. "The lab reported one final discovery regarding Leo's DNA. A small, recessive marker. They found a match." Jonathan opened the box. Inside was a child's worn, dusty drawing pencil. "What match?" "The lab traced the specific recessive marker in Leo's DNA, the one that caused his pale hazel eyes," Mark explained. "It was extremely rare. It didn't come from the Thorne line, or the Pierce line." "Where did it come from?" Jonathan demanded. "The marker is linked to a forgotten branch of the Pierce lineage, Mr. Pierce. A line that split off 3 generations ago, dismissed by your father as too bohemian. Leo's father wasn't David. Leo's father was actually your mother's personal art curator, James Foster, the man you hired and dismissed 8 years ago, who happened to be your estranged second cousin." Jonathan stared at the pencil, then looked at the vast, empty ocean. Leo wasn't a Thorne, or a Spectre. He was simply a Pierce from the Bohemian branch of the family. A secret Clara had invented to protect her cousin James from Jonathan's wrath, accidentally blaming the already compromised David. The initial DNA test was still correct, $0.00% probability. The truth was simpler, safer, and yet somehow the most shocking twist of all.